Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk on the Inclusive Terminology Glossary and Principles of Ethical Cataloguing. I am Victoria Parkinson. I'm the chair of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. The Art Library Society UK and Ireland, or ARLIS, is a society made up of art libraries, librarians, and other interested groups and individuals, and we support and enrich the profession. And we're a volunteer-run and charitable society. So if you're interested in supporting our work, you can find more about being a member on arlis.net. Today's event is organised by the Cataloguing and Classification Committee as part of a series of talks we're hosting on cataloguing and classification ethics. And we've just added 2 more talks to the series, which are on our Eventbrite page now. Thank you very much to the other members of the committee for organising this talk. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions. So if you put them in the Q&A box as you think of them, at the end, I'll read them out for Carissa to answer. Let's get going. I'm going to hand over to my fellow committee member, Annalisa, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you all. So good evening all, and welcome back to the 5th appointment with our series Cataloguing and Classification Ethics. I am Annalisa Ricciardi, and I am a member of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee and a cataloger for the Americas and Oceania office at the British Library. Today's talk, by the title Inclusive Terminology for the Heritage Sector, is presented by Carissa Chu. Carissa is a teaching assistant and PhD student in history at the University of Hawaii. Her research project seeks to uncover the experiences of belonging and exclusion felt by people of mixed African and South Asian heritage in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda between the 40s and the 80s of the 20th century. Research investigates how multicultural post-colonial East Africa found itself dealing with the legacy of a racial taxonomy that did not account for non-white multiracial existences, and rather affected by the wider colonial era debates about the distinctions between native and non-native. Carissa holds a BA in English Literature and History at the University of Edinburgh, and between 2020 and 2021, after completing an MPhil in World History at the University of Cambridge, she undertook an Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion internship with the National Library of Scotland. The project has been carried out with the aim of creating a policy for descriptive practices to be used across the library's websites, catalogues, educational resources, and exhibitions. And today, Carissa will share her insight into the practical ways that cultural heritage organizations can implement the principles of ethical cataloging, from its internal management to the audit of collections. She will offer an overview of the use of the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, and we talk about opportunities for cross-institutional collaboration via the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network. And I think Carissa has already popped the links at the top of the chat. So we'll find the links to the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network and Inclusive Terminology Glossary in there. Carissa also runs an adult learning platform called Histories of Color, designed to make the non-white histories, the histories you wish you had studied at school, accessible to a general audience. And I should pass over to Carissa now, and thank you all.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Annalisa.
Thank you, Carissa, for coming.
Just going to share my screen. I am back in England, so I flew back from Hawaii last week, so at least I've got the sun in England. Okay, so everyone can see the PowerPoint, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the rationale behind inclusive description work, and then I'm going to share some practical guidance on how to approach the task based on the work that I completed as the National Library of Scotland's former Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion intern between September 2020 and June 2021. So I'm going to be talking about the need to decolonize our descriptive practices. So I firstly wanted to clarify exactly what I mean by decolonization. To put it simply, it is a restorative justice movement that seeks to dismantle the systems, institutions, and ideologies of colonialism that still serve to perpetuate inequalities today. Although the issue of race inequality sits at the core of the decolonial project, racism and its systemic structures cannot be disentangled from other prejudices of the British Empire, including but not limited to patriarchy, heteronormativity, classism, ableism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. The need to decolonize the UK heritage sector stems from the fact that its structures and methods are rooted in colonial and imperial histories, ultimately serving the interests of those who held power and privilege in the past. What this means is that the behaviours and practices of the British heritage sector, which includes descriptive and cataloguing practices, have traditionally functioned to prioritise the perspectives and experiences of the white, the male, the upper and middle class, the heterosexual, the cisgender, and the able-bodied. And there's a wealth of literature on archival silences that has already been published, which shows us that the voices of underprivileged groups have been excluded or erased as a result of this historical colonial bias. So it's worth noting that the decolonization of language, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, is just one of the aspects of a broader effort that needs to take place to dismantle the sector's inherited colonial structures and legacies. Inclusive description work will ultimately be superficial unless it is accompanied by a cultural shift in attitudes across the sector and greater representation of people from marginalized backgrounds in the workforce, particularly in higher pay grades and positions of management. So from reviewing recruitment policies to increasing the accessibility of building spaces, abolishing unpaid internships, improving job security, offering professional development relating to issues of equality, and creating more effective support systems for those employees who are engaged in emotional labour. The sector needs to be more accommodating towards people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need to see institutions acknowledge the provenance of objects and materials that were acquired through colonial aggression or the profits of the transatlantic slave trade, along with the increased restitution and repatriation of stolen cultural artifacts and human remains that are currently held in the UK. And it's only through committing to a culture of transparency and accountability over a prolonged period of time that the heritage sector can hope to regain the trust of their underserved communities. So why is the language that we use so important for the construction of a more inclusive heritage sector? Description is essentially a tool for controlling the historical narrative. And when creating information about historical records and artifacts, curators and cataloguers must inevitably make subjective decisions about what information is deemed culturally and politically important and what terminology best reflects the communities that are represented. The function of catalogue metadata is to bring to the surface the most essential information about an item or artifact to provide our users with the context that they need to discover the right resources. And from a pragmatic standpoint, the crux of the problem is that biased and inaccurate description reduces the discoverability of historical materials and the relevance of the collection information, especially since untrained researchers are unlikely to use archaic and outdated language in their search terms. Under the UK Equality Act of 2010, the heritage sector has an ethical and legal responsibility to minimise the inequality experienced by people with protected characteristics. And language has the potential to cause great harm. Language choices can enact forms of non-physical violence, such as psychological, bureaucratic, and symbolic violence. And words can, of course, also encourage and provide legitimation for hate crimes and physical acts of violence. Consciously or not, descriptions and subject headings written and used by catalogers and curators often reproduce the semantics of difference embedded in colonial discourses of power. And when heritage institutions replicate these colonialist fallacies today, they not only contribute to the circulation of misinformation, but they perpetuate the violence of misrepresentation. And it is a matter of ethics that we challenge this misinformation and misrepresentation. When we apply essentialized ahistorical categories and labels to entire groups of people, we risk the creation of distorted information and the reproduction of harmful stereotypes. When our language is homogenizing, we cause additional harm by erasing diversity and dishonoring people's self-identities. So this brings us onto the question of how do we identify harmful language? And this area of work has sparked some open-ended debates about what is and is not offensive. But this gives rise to a problematic way of approaching the issue that views the user as somebody who chooses to take offense. But I think this becomes a way of avoiding accountability. So if we define harmful language, it is language that is disrespectful to the communities it is being used to describe. It is terminology that has actively contributed to the discrimination of groups with protected characteristics in the past. It is usually slurs and insults that are derogatory, dehumanizing, and reductive, but it is not always that obvious. Sometimes it is harmful because it mislabels people. It needlessly groups diverse communities together, or it functions to make certain groups invisible in the historical records. Harmful language perpetuates stereotypes about different genders, sexualities, ethnicities, nationalities, and disabled people that have no factual basis and have been used to incite hatred in the past and still today in the present. So there is great power in description, and we can use language as a tool through which to create and curate socially conscious catalogues, collections, displays, and learning resources. But one of the main concerns among heritage professionals that I have spoken with is that they lack the confidence in their ability to identify and replace harmful terminology. Language is constantly evolving, and a lot of the preferred terminology today continues to be contested. But nevertheless, we need to make these informed decisions to the best of our ability when it comes to the language that we choose to use to describe groups with protected characteristics and the stories that we are choosing to tell. So to help the UK heritage sector tackle this problem, I started creating an inclusive terminology glossary that includes information about historic and contemporary language relating to groups with protected characteristics. So I know that a lot of people have been using the guidance produced in the Netherlands, the Tropen Museum's Words Matter glossary, and also resources produced in the USA, like the Archives for Black Lives Matter Philadelphia's anti-racist description resources, and also some vocabularies produced in Australia relating to Aboriginal Australians. But we really need to start addressing the specific language legacies that are unique to Britain and the British Empire. So what I've done is collected all the existing published guidance, and then I've also asked some scholars with expertise in these particular fields to review the information that the glossary contains. So there should be a link to part of the glossary in the chat so that you can have a look at what is there. So the purpose of the glossary is so that heritage professionals can use it to identify and locate harmful materials across online databases, which can then be used to implement content advice and filters. But also because it provides guidance on the preferred contemporary terms, it can be used to inform decisions when it comes to editing metadata. And also it functions as a guide for the creation of new descriptions and learning resources. So currently the inclusive terminology glossary is being moved on to Google Documents, which is where you can see it at the moment, which allows anybody to contribute to it. So anybody can go on and make a suggestion, and then I can add that into the document. It's been a slow process since I left the National Library. I haven't had the time to transfer all the sections over, but it is ongoing work, and you can use that link to find the other sections in the folder, which will be coming very soon. The plan for the future is that the National Library of Scotland want to develop this into a more sophisticated online database with the help of external partners. So this work is ongoing and it relies on collaboration and contributions. So this is just a screenshot of the first section of the glossary on African American history and the Atlantic slave trade. So just to explain, you can see the potentially harmful term in the first column, and it includes singular and plural forms and also multiple spelling variations and misspellings and archaic spellings, because I'm aware that some catalogue search engines that the National Library of Scotland had, they were not very responsive. So if you put in a singular term, you wouldn't even get results back that contain that term in the plural form. So the searching itself can be quite tedious. So the glossary kind of reflects the needs of heritage professionals. There's then a contextual note. And as I've already mentioned, a lot of these terms are contested. So it's not simply a straightforward replace one term with another, but I've explained the context and the changing history of these terms, and then linked in the references where I have got these sources of information so that you can follow them up to find out more. And also there's a time period and region tag just to make it a bit more searchable. And also the time period can be really important when doing this work so that we can locate materials within particular collections that might contain particular terms. So as I was saying, the work is ongoing, and there is a Slack network that you are welcome to join if you wish to contribute to the conversation about the future of this work. I think it has a couple of hundred of heritage professionals on it at the moment who are all interested in this area of work. It hasn't been particularly active. However, it is there as a network that anybody is able to use as they wish. Anybody can post in it and introduce themselves. So again, that's another link that should be shared in the chat if anyone wants to kind of keep up with this area of work. Okay, so just to show you quite quickly, this is an example of some of the material that I audited across the National Library's online collections. In this case, it was our music catalogue, which just kind of shows some of the examples of the search results that I was getting back from using the glossary. In this case, all of the examples are language that appears in the original titles of the music collection. So it's not something we can change or censor, but it's something that we wanted to be aware of so we can think about how we present that information to the users, and if it's necessary to have some kind of content advice to go with that. And you can also see in the images that you're not going to get those results back necessarily from simply doing a key term search. So I was also in conversation with cataloguers and curators to kind of identify areas of the collection that might contain these potentially harmful materials. So at the National Library of Scotland, we also implemented a small sample of metadata changes in the archives and manuscripts catalogue. So for example, we replaced chattel slaves and Negroes with enslaved Africans. We capitalized the word indigenous in the North American context. We changed lunacy to mental health. So all of these examples were things that came up in the catalogue descriptions. They had been created by former archivists They were not part of the original language of the texts. In one case, there was a quoted reference to Hottentot girls in a description, which we supplemented with the correct ethnicity, Khoikhoi, just in square brackets to kind of make that distinction and make it more searchable for the users. We also reviewed the use of the term Orientalist. So in the Archives and Manuscripts catalogue, there was a use of epithets for different agents who are mentioned in the catalogue. So Orientalist was one that came up quite a lot in terms of a person's occupation. But it's this outdated colonialist term for scholars who took an interest in any aspect of South Asian, East Asian, or Middle Eastern history, languages, and cultures. So by replacing the use of this epithet with more specific labels such as sinologist, Semitic studies professor, civil servant in India, and as you can see from the examples, this term was used to refer to such a diverse range of interests and occupations and specialisms that it made it really difficult for users to find the material that they needed. So we reject this idea that the so-called Orient is a single geographical entity. And then another example is the use of the label planter, which again came up in our epithets, which historically has loosely been used to describe both Scottish tea planters in India and Scottish slave owners in the Caribbean. So for a user who is researching the Atlantic slave trade or Afro-Caribbean history, it's more helpful that we use our catalogue labels to describe rather than to conceal any connections to the slave trade. So in most of these cases, it's about improving clarity of the labels to create a more accurate collection information. Another term or terms that keep proving problematic was terms like African explorer, which were used to describe white British explorers in Africa. But we have this problem with the terms African and Indian being used in this way. So for example, we would replace this with British explorer in Africa, or in the case of Indian administrator, it was actually what we're trying to say is a British administrator in India. Because this creates confusion and it's built off this assumption that people of color could not hold certain job titles. So with my work with the National Library, I wasn't focused on implementing content advice and filters. However, I did look quite closely at the strategies that other institutions had started to use. So it appears that the least labor-intensive approach would be an institutional statement or a catalogue level warning that explains to users that they might encounter discriminatory materials across the online catalogues and collections. So an example of a catalogue level warning can be seen on the Bristol Archives, British Empire and Commonwealth collection catalogue. The University of Virginia Archives also has a warning at the bottom of their online catalogue. And at the bottom of every item page on the Horniman Museum's online collection catalogue, there is also a warning that appears to explain the presence of discriminatory language. At an item level, which is a lot more labor intensive, some institutions have managed to put in some content warnings. In some cases, these have been put in the title, which is a very effective way of making sure that the user sees these warnings if they access the page from a search engine rather than through the catalogue. So the Digital Public Library of America and the New York Public Library have both used this method when describing graphic content contained in lynching photographs. So it's a way that you can ensure the user will see that warning before they access that individual page. So there's some examples on the slide. It might be a bit small to see them. But Institutions such as BBC Rewind and the Victoria and Albert Museum have implemented some more sophisticated content filters. So on the BBC archive, you have to create an account and then opt whether you wish to view certain types of sensitive material or not. And then on the V&A online catalogue, which is on the bottom left of the slide, if you search potentially discriminatory language, then the images are automatically blurred out until you choose to view them. And along with this, the V&A provide item level content warnings. Their descriptions contain an impressive amount of historical context about their items. And they also have a suggest a feedback button that users can use to report discriminatory material themselves. So the main focus of my internship was actually to develop a formal policy to govern the way that the National Library of Scotland manages its descriptive and interpretive practices over time in order to meet modern standards of description for protected characteristics and other areas of cultural sensitivity. So I'm going to finish by sharing these 10 principles for inclusive description and ethical cataloguing work that kind of set the framework for using my glossary as part of this broader effort to decolonize the sector. So firstly, the acquisition or providing access to an item does not imply endorsement of any statements or opinions contained therein. This might seem obvious, but I think as a user, you don't necessarily understand the restrictions that the heritage sector is working with. It is the duty of cultural heritage institutions to accurately maintain the historical record. It is not appropriate for cultural heritage professionals to alter or censor the original historical record, including language contained within collections, published titles, and official names. Again, it's important to be kind of transparent with about this with users, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this kind of work, that it's this project of censorship, which it is not. We're not changing the original record in any way. We're actually improving its accuracy so that you can find materials more easily. So cultural heritage institutions have a responsibility to meet modern descriptive standards and describe and interpret materials in a manner that is accurate, respectful, and responsive to the communities who create, use, and are represented in their collections. It is the duty of cultural heritage institutions to improve the quality of educational information for the purpose of enhancing and maintaining the authenticity, integrity, and reliability of records and resources, and to promote the ethical use of the information contained within their collections and resources. Where the original language in collections is harmful or discriminatory, cultural heritage institutions should strive to provide additional historical context and appropriate advisory content. Description and interpretation should be harnessed as a tool to improve the discoverability of resources relating to underrepresented communities. Descriptive and interpretive practice should reflect professional values and ethics and contribute to a culture of accountability, trust, and transparency. Cultural heritage institutions have a responsibility to support their staff with the task of inclusive description work. This includes emotional support as well as professional development and training to ensure staff are equipped to complete inclusive description work judiciously and thoughtfully. And this is a particularly important aspect of the work that within my role, I didn't manage to give a huge amount of consideration, but there are some kind of training programs out there, such as by Intersectional GLAM by Jas Thethi, which offers specific training for cultural heritage professionals in these areas of equality and diversity. So cultural heritage institutions should share their expertise and use their voices to reform national and international frameworks of agreed standards and vocabularies. So I didn't really manage to go into this, but also in terms of relying on Library of Congress subject headings and the decimal Dewey system. Again, we're relying on vocabularies produced in the USA that do not account specifically for the terminology used in Britain. And also they have a lot of historic, racist and other prejudiced biases within them. So we need to also be inclusive when doing indexing and subject headings. And then finally, descriptive and interpretive standards will need to continue to be updated to reflect changes in knowledge, practice, and values in the future. So this shouldn't be viewed as an area of work that can simply be completed, but an ongoing aspect of the job. So I will end there and welcome any questions. Thank you for listening. Oops.